And finally, for our movement literacy, talking about the trunk, core, spine here. And the first thing that we'll touch on with this is core bracing and when to belt. So there's a lot of different interpretation of the core bracing, and I'll be perfectly honest in saying that I'm still kind of somewhere in the middle on this, but generally speaking, when we're doing anything that's compound compressive loading, so we're thinking bench, back squat, front squat, deadlift, push press, anything that's kind of a major mover, I think that at the very least on the downward or the eccentric phase of the motion, we should feel like we are kind of cinching or bracing in the core. It's not necessarily a complete flex or squeeze as hard as you can, but we do want to have trunk activation for spinal stability. And that leads right into belts. When should we wear a belt? My rule of thumb is above 90%. So if we have 90% or more on a back squat or a deadlift, it's a good time to throw a belt on. It's not mandatory, but it's, in my opinion, a good time to do so. Outside of that, I personally don't think that it's necessary for people to wear a belt, especially with the type of athletes that we're working with. So if you have any questions on when to belt, you can always hit us up on that. But beyond that, the trunk and the torso, the main thing is we want to have complementary angles to whatever it is we're doing. So if we look at, for instance, like a split squat, what I think about is trying to have my trunk angle parallel to my shin angle. So as I descend into the bottom of the squat, this angle and this angle should be pretty similar. If you're more of an upright squatter, you have more of a vertical shin, then the trunk should reflect that as well. And what this is doing is giving us optimal relationships above and below the joint. Now, if we think about dynamic actions, so walking lunges, farmer's carries, anything that's in motion, what I think about is just kind of our gait mechanics and our coiling pattern of the trunk. So when I say coiling, what I'm thinking about is taking this shoulder and just kind of migrating it towards this hip. So again, it's not a full-on rotation, we're just kind of squeezing into it to get a mechanical locking above and below the hip. So if I'm doing a heavy farmer's carry, I just want to have some subtle rotations as I'm walking so that I'm not in that military posture as I'm going through a locomotive pattern. The last thing on the trunk and the spine, when we're doing anything, for instance, coming up from an RDL or we're in a bent row, what we don't want to see is too much extension or rounding in the low back. And what I'll see a lot of the times is when people finish an RDL, they'll finish like this. And what this is doing is just putting compressive force down on the lumbar. So what I want to think about is trying to finish tall and finishing through my glutes so that my spine is still stacked at the top and I'm not getting that compressive force on the lumbar.